This is a particularly special affair tonight, for me certainly. I am in the company of my partner, my staff, my neighbors, some very friends of many, many years, and a phalanx of 10 of the best vignerons in France. This is a moment that gives me great pleasure because at the same time we are joined in this womb of love and affection to discuss one of my favorite topics. And I'm accompanied by two extraordinary people, Victoria Anstead, who will be the moderator this evening. And I met Victoria very recently, but she has taken charge of this whole affair. This would not have happened if it were not for her. I have all these ideas, and as my partner Kerry would say, I'm in desperate need of an enabler. So here you have Victoria. And Ian Tattersall was one of the first people who crossed the threshold of my original wine shop. And one of the first people who believed in what we were doing, who understood the concept of terroir in its entirety, perhaps more profoundly than even I did at the time. And he's one of the most extraordinary scientists, his modesty aside. So I think we're in for a very special evening tonight. I really felt it was important for me to advance the understanding of wine, which is to say the role of wine in our culture and how our culture and civilization is expressed in this rather spectacular product. One of the things that's made me most conscious of the importance of wine is understanding as I travel through places where it's so difficult to plant the vine, and yet we've done it. As Ian will explain to us, we've done it over thousands of years when there were no backhoes, there were no tractors, there were just the human imagination and our physical capacity of doing things. And so I think to put wine in that special place and use that as a vehicle to explore our civilization. That's why I wanted to do this.
Wine itself is a kind of a mirror for science, that we can look at wine through the lens of science, but you can also look at science through the lens of wine. Alcohol is basically toxic to organisms, and alcohol is a very important component of wine. It turns out that the yeasts that produce the alcohol in the wine probably first produced alcohol as a way of fending off competitors. But something really weird happened in the lineage that led to human beings, but it happened before the split with the apes. So it happened a long time ago, maybe 14 million years ago, and there was some mutation, genetic mutation in that lineage that led to the emergence of a new kind of enzyme for processing alcohol, for breaking down alcohol, that sort of increased the capacity of the animals that had it by an order of magnitude, and is what allows us to drink 15% wine today without becoming horribly drunk if we don't have too much of it.
When did humans start making wine? What's the first archaeological wine?
Well, the cool thing about that is that they started making it almost as soon as they could. Now, the very earliest traces of wine have been recently reported from a site in Georgia in the Caucasus. They've been reported from this site in the Caucasus that is about 8,000 years old, and from the very beginning of the Neolithic. Now, the Neolithic period was the period right at the end of the last ice age when humans first started to settle down and live in villages and raise crops and domesticate animals. They also started to make pottery. And the first evidence we have of wine is in pottery vessels 8,000 years old from a few sites in southern Georgia.
How does wine, on that note, how does wine affect our senses?
It's not just about the senses that are stimulated by wine. The reason that I think wine is so compelling goes to to me, a more central part of who we are. We have our senses, but what is fascinating about great wine, and I think this is from my experience, it is only certain wine of a certain breed that actually gets inside of us and causes associative memories to happen. For me, the joy of a bottle of wine is not simply the experience of drinking it. You talk about the savory elements of wine, or the texture of wine, or the smell of wine, all wonderful things, but those are somewhat ephemeral. They pass, they go in and out. The beauty of a great wine is that it sits inside you. And it reminds you over and over and over again of all the good times you had drinking it. It reminds you of the friends. It reminds you of the meal you had. It makes you, not only that, but it stimulates you. It's not quite an hallucinogenic. It's not psilocybin. It's not LSD, but it has an almost mystical ability to take your mind outside of the ordinary. To me, that's why wine has taken such an important place in our culture.
We talk about place being a mental concept, an emotional concept, the sense of community, the sense of terroir.
Well, that's correct. You know, the thing is that every animal has a sense of place. Every animal has some way of describing to itself where it is in the world. But what humans do with place is ascribe all these associations with place. And there are magical places for many, many, many reasons. And one of the best reasons for a place to be special is because it's where special wine is made.
The terroir, this sense of place, is what popped into my imagination when I first stepped inside the little liquor shop that my dad had created in place of his luncheonette. And I would look in I would come in when I was a kid in college, and I'd come in and I'd look at all these labels, and what struck me, I mean, this was a time when the only wine of quality that anybody acknowledged was from Europe, and when you look at these labels, it's all about geography. You don't know what grapes are in there. Nobody talks about Cabernet or Pinot Noir or whatever it is. It was geography. Every name on the label was about a particular village, not just France, not just Germany, but much, much more precise. And that's what struck me immediately. And when it came time for me to make a transition of career, to literally stumble into the wine thing, that was what caught my imagination. So when you see this geography, and we talk about terroir, we talk about soil type, we talk about climate, we talk about the grape type that is sort of a natural proclivity for a certain place, but even much more importantly, the fundamental nature of that is this microbiome, the particular bacteria that exist in a certain place. We have our own. That's why I've always said we have personal terroir.
Neil, you told a story of a wine producer who changed their cellars and how the wine so drastically changed. Could you talk about that a bit?
Right. You know, it's fascinating to me because being at this for over 40 years, that I can see the changes. I've worked with, in several instances, with some of the people actually in the audience this evening, represent the third generation of growers for me. And there are times as we have advanced in our business that I've watched the craft of the wine merchant turn into the business of wine. And this has had dramatic impact on us. And the wealth that has been created within the world of wine has had good effects and bad effects. And in certain instances, the growth in a family domain has caused them to move their cellar, to recreate to build a larger cuvée, or just they need a place for this new equipment, all kinds of reasons to do things. Sometimes the magic gets lost. There's an environment that's been changed, and this wonderful, we have this wonderful term in French, and this happens so much with older wines, and we open a wine that's 30 or 35 or 40 years old, and there's this stink that comes off the wine, which I adore. And it's called moisi de la cave. And the moisi de la cave is the mold of the cellar. That also is the individual element that creates a terroir. Why is it that a grower with vines right next to another grower who's harvesting at exactly the same time, and they're producing the wine according to the same basic way of making wine? It's not a mystery how to make wine. Obviously, it was done 8,000 years ago. Why is it that one man's wine, as opposed to his or her neighbor, they're done under the same circumstances, and yet they're different. It's not just the personality of the person that is being expressed in the wine, it's this microbiome, right? There's this special yeast that exists, or the bacteria that exists in a particular cellar, and when that change happens, voila, it's a whole new world. Sometimes for the better, excuse me, rarely, and sometimes we lose something very, very special.
I think the point that Neil has been making about the microbiome is incredibly important to virtually everything that we do. Most of the diversity in the world is actually expressed in tiny, tiny single-celled animals that we can't see. That most of the diversity in the world is actually invisible to us, to our naked eye. And it's only within the last decade or two that people have realized that we are not, as individuals, single organisms. We are a whole ecosystem. We are walking ecosystems.
Our perceptions can so often be determined by our circumstance. And I think if we are honest with ourselves, we know that no matter how intelligent we claim to be, we are always subject to our emotions, which is this almost anti-intellectual element of our character. It is maybe the soulful intrusion into our rational life. It's important for us to take us outside of the ordinary day-to-day when we're talking about the things that we're enjoying from moment to moment. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.